The house of Abraham, how Isaac and Ishmael became a family in conflict. Did you know that Jews and Arabs share the same lineage? The conflict between them is, in many ways, a family feud. Have you ever wondered who the ancestor was that first set this division in motion? From this ancient family conflict, both Judaism and Islam eventually emerged. Part 1. The Seeds of Conflict. The smoke still rose from Jerusalem's temple when the Roman soldiers counted their captives. The year was 70 CE, and the Great Revolt was finally crushed. General Vespasian's son Titus had done what his father commanded. He had broken the back of Jewish resistance and razed the holiest site in Judaism to the ground. But this was not the beginning of Jewish exile. That story reaches back much further, to a promise made in the desert and a covenant that would both bless and burden a people for 4 millennia. Long before Rome ever heard of the Jews, Abraham had walked away from everything familiar. Around 2000 BCE, in the sophisticated city of Ur, he abandoned the gods of his fathers and followed a voice that promised him a land, a people, and a blessing that would reach all nations. But with that promise came a warning. Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. Yet the fulfillment of that promise would come through a path marked by conflict within Abraham's own household. His wife Sarah was barren, and after years of waiting for the promised child, she gave her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abraham as a concubine. "Go in to my servant," Sarah told her husband. "It may be that I shall obtain children by her." Hagar conceived and bore Abraham a son, Ishmael, but the birth created tension in the household. Hagar, now mother to Abraham's heir, began to despise her barren mistress. Sarah, jealous and bitter, dealt harshly with her servant until Hagar fled into the wilderness. There, an angel found her by a spring and made her a promise that would echo through history. "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, and he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him." Hagar returned, and Ishmael grew up as Abraham's firstborn. For 13 years, he was the son of promise, the heir to the covenant. But when Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him again with news that would split his lineage forever. Sarah, now 90, would bear a son. This child, not Ishmael, would be the true heir of the covenant. Sarah laughed at the impossibility, but Isaac was born as promised. The name meant laughter, for Sarah declared, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." But the laughter was bitter as well as joyful, for Isaac's birth meant Ishmael's displacement. The tension between the two boys, half-brothers born to the same father but different mothers, grew as they matured. At Isaac's weaning feast, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking her son. Her words to Abraham were harsh and final. "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Abraham was deeply troubled, for Ishmael was still his son. But God confirmed Sarah's demand. "Let it not be displeasing in your sight because of the boy or because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac your offspring shall be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Hagar and Ishmael were sent into the wilderness of Beersheba with only bread and water. When the water ran out, Hagar placed her dying son under a bush and went a bowshot away, unable to watch him die. But God heard the boy's cry and renewed his promise. "Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." This was the first great division in Abraham's family, but it would not be the last. Isaac became the father of Jacob, later renamed Israel, whose 12 sons would become the tribes of Israel and the Jewish people. Ishmael became the father of 12 princes and, according to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, the ancestor of the Arab peoples. The separation was complete, but the blood connection remained. Isaac and Ishmael were brothers, children of the same father, inheritors of overlapping promises. When Abraham died at 175 years old, both sons came together to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. It was the last time they would unite in common purpose. This ancient family division would echo through millennia. The descendants of Isaac and Ishmael would inhabit the same region, claim connection to the same patriarch, and worship the same God of Abraham. Yet they would also compete for the same land, dispute the same inheritance, and often find themselves on opposite sides of history's great conflicts. The rivalry was not merely political or territorial but theological. Both lines claimed to be the true heirs of Abraham's covenant. Both believed they carried the authentic tradition of monotheism. Both saw themselves as chosen peoples with divine mandates. The conflict between Jews and Arabs that would dominate Middle Eastern politics for centuries had its roots in this primordial family dispute over birthright and blessing. From the very beginning, the Jewish story was one of displacement. Abraham's grandson Jacob fled his homeland to escape his brother's wrath. Jacob's sons sold their brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt. Famine drove the entire family to seek refuge in the land of the pharaohs. What began as temporary refuge became permanent settlement, and settlement became bondage. For 4 centuries, the descendants of Abraham labored under Egyptian taskmasters. They built cities and monuments, but the land was not theirs. They multiplied and prospered, but they remained strangers. Even when Moses led them out of Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, a generation born in exile, dying before they could taste the promised land. When they finally crossed the Jordan River, they found Canaan inhabited by others: Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, and Philistines. The land of promise required conquest. Even in their homeland, the Jews would never be alone, never be unchallenged, never be completely secure. King David united the tribes and established Jerusalem as their capital. His son Solomon built the first temple, creating a focal point for Jewish worship and identity. For a brief moment, it seemed the promise was fulfilled, but the unity was fragile. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted until 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed the temple and carried the Jews into their first great exile. By the waters of Babylon, they sat and wept when they remembered Zion. For 70 years, they lived as strangers in a strange land, preserving their identity through memory, law, and hope. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed them to return, many chose to stay. The diaspora had begun, not through persecution, but through choice. Some Jews would always live elsewhere, always be minorities, always be different. The Second Temple was built, but it was smaller than Solomon's. The returning exiles were fewer than those who had left, and the land remained contested. Greeks, Seleucids, Ptolemies, and Romans all claimed authority over Judea. Jewish identity was forged in this crucible of foreign rule and religious resistance. In 167 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV desecrated the temple, erected a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, and forbade Jewish religious practices. The Maccabean revolt that followed was both a war of independence and a religious war, Jews fighting not just for political freedom but for the right to remain Jewish. But independence was temporary. In 63 BCE, Pompey's legions marched into Jerusalem, and Judea became a Roman client state. The Jews had their temple, their law, and their traditions, but they were ruled by Caesar. Tension was inevitable. The Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 73 CE was the culmination of a century of Roman rule. Taxes, corruption, cultural assimilation, and religious interference had pushed the Jewish population to the breaking point. When the revolt began, it was driven by messianic fervor and nationalist pride. Many Jews believed God would deliver them as he had delivered their ancestors from Egypt and Babylon. But Rome was not Egypt, and Vespasian was not Pharaoh. The revolt was crushed with methodical brutality. Jerusalem was besieged, starved, and finally taken. The temple was burned. The priesthood was scattered. The sacrificial system that had defined Jewish worship for 1,000 years came to an end. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the destruction, recorded that over 1 million Jews died in the siege. Thousands more were sold into slavery. The survivors faced a choice: assimilate into Roman culture or preserve their identity without their temple, their priesthood, and their homeland. Most chose preservation. Led by rabbis like Yohanan ben Zakkai, they created a new form of Judaism, one based on study, prayer, and communal memory rather than sacrifice and temple worship. The synagogue replaced the temple. The rabbi replaced the priest. The Torah scroll became the most sacred object in Jewish life. But this transformation came at a cost. Jews were now a people without a center, a religion without a homeland, a nation scattered among the nations. The diaspora that had begun in Babylon became permanent. From Spain to Persia, from North Africa to the Rhine Valley, Jewish communities took root in foreign soil, always minorities, always different, always vulnerable. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE marked the beginning of the longest exile in human history. It would last nearly 2,000 years, and it would shape not only Jewish identity but the very meaning of what it means to be a stranger in the world. Part 2. The birth of Christian antisemitism. In the decades following the Temple's destruction, a new faith was spreading through the Roman Empire. It had been born among the Jews, proclaimed by a Jewish teacher, and initially followed by Jewish disciples. But Christianity's rapid expansion among Gentiles created a theological crisis that would poison Jewish-Christian relations for centuries. Jesus of Nazareth had been a Jewish rabbi who preached to Jewish audiences about Jewish themes, repentance, redemption, and the coming kingdom of God. His earliest followers, led by his brother James and the Apostle Peter, saw him as the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy. They continued to observe Jewish law, worship in the temple, and live as Jews. But Paul of Tarsus had a different vision. A Pharisee who had initially persecuted the Christian movement, Paul experienced a dramatic conversion and became convinced that Jesus' message was meant for all humanity, not just the Jews. He argued that Gentile converts did not need to become Jews first. They did not need to be circumcised, observe dietary laws, or follow the complex requirements of Torah. This decision opened Christianity to the broader Roman world, but it also created a fundamental problem. If Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism, why did most Jews reject it? If Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, why did the Jewish people refuse to accept him? The early Christian answer was devastating in its simplicity. The Jews had rejected their own Messiah. They had chosen Barabbas over Jesus, demanded his crucifixion, and refused to recognize the fulfillment of their own prophecies. They were no longer the chosen people, Christians were. The church had replaced Israel as God's covenant community. This replacement theology, or supersessionism, became fundamental to Christian doctrine. It not only explained Jewish rejection of Christianity but provided theological justification for viewing Jews as obsolete, stubborn, and even cursed by God. The Gospel of Matthew, written around 80 to 90 CE, put these words in the mouths of the Jewish crowd demanding Jesus' crucifixion. His blood be on us and on our children. For centuries, Christian preachers would use this verse to justify the persecution of Jews as Christ killers, who had called divine judgment upon themselves. As Christianity became more Gentile and less Jewish, the theological divide deepened. Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Origen, and John Chrysostom developed increasingly harsh anti-Jewish rhetoric. Jews were portrayed as blind, stubborn, and rejected by God. Their exile and suffering were seen as proof of divine displeasure. John Chrysostom, one of the most influential church fathers, delivered a series of sermons against the Jews in 386 to 387 CE. He called Jews wretched and miserable, claimed they were fit for slaughter, and argued that God had abandoned them forever. Such rhetoric from respected Christian leaders gave religious sanction to anti-Jewish sentiment throughout the Roman world. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, the balance of power shifted dramatically. What had once been a persecuted minority faith became the favored religion of the empire. Jews, meanwhile, remained a marginalized and increasingly distrusted minority. Christian Roman law began to restrict Jewish rights. Jews were banned from owning Christian slaves, holding public office, or building new synagogues. Intermarriage between Jews and Christians was forbidden. Jewish religious practices were scrutinized and sometimes prohibited. The Theodosian Code, compiled in 438 CE, included numerous anti-Jewish laws. It declared that Jews were an abominable sect and placed severe restrictions on their commercial and religious activities. This legal framework would influence European law for more than 1,000 years. But the most damaging development was the theological crystallization of the deicide charge, the accusation that Jews were collectively responsible for killing Christ. This was not merely a historical claim about first-century events. It became a perpetual condemnation that applied to all Jews in all places at all times. The logic was circular and inescapable. Jews had killed Christ, therefore God had punished them with exile and suffering. Their continued exile and suffering proved their guilt and God's displeasure. Any attempt by Jews to improve their condition was seen as rebellion against divine will. This theological framework created what historian Gavin Langmuir called chimeric antisemitism, hatred based not on what Jews actually did, but on what they were imagined to represent. Jews became symbols of all that was anti-Christian, anti-God, and anti-good in the world. The transformation was complete. A Jewish teacher who had preached love and compassion became the foundation for a religion that justified hatred and persecution of his own people. The most successful Jewish missionary in history, Paul of Tarsus, had helped create a theological framework that would torment Jews for 2 millennia. By the end of the ancient period, the pattern was established. Jews were scattered throughout the known world, always minorities, always different, and now burdened with a theological stigma that made them perpetual outsiders in Christian society. The diaspora was no longer just a political reality. It had become a spiritual condition, a mark of divine disfavor that would follow Jews wherever they went. Part 3: Medieval Persecution and the Ghetto. The morning mist clung to the Rhine Valley as the Crusaders approached the city of Worms. It was May 1096, and Count Emicho of Flaunheim had gathered nearly 10,000 men to march toward Jerusalem and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. But first, they had other enemies to address. "Why should we travel to the ends of the earth to fight Christ's enemies?" Emicho proclaimed. "When his killers live among us?" The Jewish community of Worms, established for centuries, had heard rumors of what was happening in other Rhine cities. In Speyer, Crusaders had killed 11 Jews. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter had been attacked. Now it was their turn. Rabbi Kalonimos ben Meshulam gathered his congregation in the synagogue. Outside, they could hear the growing crowd, the cries of "God wills it!" and "Avenge Christ's blood." The rabbi faced his people with a terrible choice that would echo through Jewish history: conversion or death. "Sanctify God's name," he told them. "Better to die as Jews than live as Christians." What followed was called Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name through martyrdom. Fathers killed their own children rather than see them forcibly baptized. Mothers threw their babies into the Rhine rather than surrender them to the mob. The synagogue became a funeral pyre as Jews chose death over conversion. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the late 11th and 12th centuries, the Crusades unleashed waves of anti-Jewish violence across Europe. The First Crusade alone resulted in the massacre of thousands of Jews in the Rhineland. Entire communities were wiped out. Centuries of Jewish life in the Holy Roman Empire were nearly destroyed. The Crusaders' logic was simple and terrible. If they were fighting a holy war to reclaim Christ's tomb from the infidels, why not first deal with the infidels in their own lands? Jews were not just non-Christians, they were Christ killers, the ultimate enemies of the faith. But the violence was not random. It had an economic dimension that would shape Jewish history for centuries. Crusades were expensive. Knights needed money for equipment, horses, and supplies. Many had borrowed from Jewish moneylenders to finance their expeditions. What better way to solve a debt problem than to eliminate the creditors in the name of God? This connection between religious violence and economic resentment was not accidental. Medieval Christian law, based on biblical prohibitions against usury, forbade Christians from lending money at interest. Jews, as non-Christians, were not bound by these restrictions. They became the medieval world's bankers by default, not by choice. The irony was profound. Christian society created an economic niche for Jews, then hated them for filling it. Jews became moneylenders because they were excluded from most other professions. They could not own land, join guilds, or hold public office. Commerce and finance were among the few occupations open to them. But this economic role made them perpetually vulnerable. When times were good, their services were welcomed. When times were bad, they became scapegoats. Debt could be eliminated by expelling or killing the creditors. Economic crisis could be blamed on Jewish greed and manipulation. The blood libel accusation first appeared in Norwich, England, in 1144. A boy named William was found dead, and local Christians accused Jews of murdering him to use his blood in Passover rituals. The charge was absurd. Jewish law strictly forbids the consumption of blood, and ritual murder is antithetical to Jewish values. But the accusation spread across Europe like wildfire. In 1171, the entire Jewish community of Blois was burned alive based on a blood libel charge. In 1255, Hugh of Lincoln's death was blamed on Jews, leading to the execution of 18 members of the Jewish community. The accusation became so common that popes and emperors occasionally issued statements denying its validity, a fact that only confirmed its widespread acceptance. The blood libel was more than a local superstition. It was a powerful tool for turning popular resentment against Jewish communities. It provided a religious justification for violence and a theological explanation for Jewish otherness. If Jews could murder Christian children for ritual purposes, they were not just different, they were evil. In 1348, the Black Death struck Europe. Within 4 years, the plague had killed an estimated 1/3 of the continent's population. Cities were decimated. Economic systems collapsed. Social order broke down. And in the midst of this catastrophe, someone had to be blamed. Jews became the perfect scapegoats. They were already stigmatized as Christ killers and ritual murderers. They were economically resented as moneylenders. They were religiously suspect as non-Christians. And they seemed to be dying from the plague at lower rates than their Christian neighbors, a fact that was probably due to Jewish hygiene practices and dietary laws, but which appeared suspicious to medieval minds. The accusation was that Jews had poisoned the wells and caused the plague as part of a conspiracy to destroy Christianity. In 1348, the Jewish community of Chillon, Switzerland, was tortured until several members confessed to well poisoning. Word of the confession spread, and anti-Jewish riots erupted across Europe. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were killed in a single day. In Mainz, 6,000 Jews died. In Frankfurt, the Jewish quarter was completely destroyed. The violence was so extensive that some regions were left virtually without Jewish inhabitants. Pope Clement VI issued a bull pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague like everyone else and that the disease was present in areas where no Jews lived. His logic was ignored. The massacres continued. Those Jewish communities that survived the plague years faced increasingly restrictive laws. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had required Jews to wear distinctive clothing, pointed hats, yellow badges, or other markers that identified them as non-Christians. This visible segregation made Jews easy targets during times of crisis. More systematic segregation came with the creation of ghettos. The first official ghetto was established in Venice in 1516, confining Jews to a specific quarter of the city that was locked at night. The word ghetto itself came from the Italian ghetto, referring to the foundry that had previously occupied the site. The Venetian model spread throughout Europe. Rome created a ghetto in 1555. Prague established one in 1597. Frankfurt, Vienna, and dozens of other cities followed suit. Jews were required to live in designated areas, usually the least desirable parts of the city, surrounded by walls and gates that were locked from sunset to sunrise. The ghetto served multiple purposes. It isolated Jews from Christian society, reducing the risk of religious contamination. It made Jewish communities easy to monitor and control. It provided a ready source of tax revenue, as ghetto residents paid special levies for the privilege of remaining in the city. And it created a visible symbol of Jewish degradation and Christian dominance. Life in the ghetto was cramped, unsanitary, and dangerous. Buildings were packed together, fire was a constant threat, and disease spread quickly in the confined space. Jews were forbidden to expand beyond the ghetto walls, so as populations grew, buildings grew taller and more crowded. But the ghetto also preserved Jewish life and culture. Isolated from the outside world, Jewish communities developed rich traditions of learning, prayer, and mutual support. The Talmudic academies of Prague and Vilna produced some of the greatest Jewish scholars in history. Yiddish literature and culture flourished in the ghettos of Eastern Europe. The price of survival was steep. Jews lived as permanent minorities, always at the mercy of Christian authorities, always vulnerable to expulsion or worse. They were allowed to exist, but never to belong. They could practice their religion, but only in designated spaces and under constant suspicion. By the end of the medieval period, the pattern was clear. Jews were useful but unwanted, necessary but despised. They filled economic roles that Christian society needed but morally condemned. They were granted protection but denied dignity. They were allowed to survive but never to thrive. The medieval period established the basic structure of Jewish life in the diaspora: segregation, vulnerability, and perpetual minority status. Jews learned to live as strangers in every land, to build communities that could be quickly abandoned, to create portable wealth that could survive confiscation and exile. They had become the eternal wanderers, carrying their homeland in their hearts and their learning, never quite citizens of anywhere, always ready to move when the next persecution came. The diaspora was no longer just a temporary condition, it had become a way of life. Part 4: Expulsion and Eastern Refuge. The bells of Seville Cathedral rang out across the city as Isabella and Ferdinand processed through streets lined with cheering crowds. It was January 2nd, 1492, and the Catholic monarchs had just completed the Reconquista, the 7th century campaign to expel Muslim rule from Iberian Peninsula. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, had fallen. Christian Spain was finally united under one faith and one crown. But for Queen Isabella, the victory was incomplete. Spain contained another religious minority that threatened the purity of her Christian kingdom. 3 months after Granada's fall, she signed the Alhambra Decree. All Jews must convert to Christianity or leave Spain within 4 months. The edict was devastating in its scope. Spain's Jewish community was one of the oldest and most prosperous in Europe. For over 1,000 years, Jews had lived in Iberia, creating a rich culture that blended Hebrew, Arabic, and Romance influences. They had served as physicians to kings, translators of Greek and Arabic texts, tax collectors, and merchants. They had produced philosophers like Maimonides, poets like Judah Halevi, and biblical commentators like Abraham ibn Ezra. This was the golden age of Spanish Jewry, a time when Jewish culture flourished under Muslim rule and, initially, under Christian reconquest. Jews spoke Ladino, a language that mixed Hebrew with medieval Spanish. They lived in thriving communities in Toledo, Córdoba, Seville, and Barcelona. They were not merely tolerated, they were integral to Spanish society. But that integration had always been precarious. The Christian reconquest had gradually changed the atmosphere. In 1391, anti-Jewish riots swept through Castile and Aragon. Thousands of Jews were killed. Thousands more were forcibly converted. The conversos, converted Jews, became a distinct social class, Christian in name but suspect in loyalty. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was initially created to investigate these new Christians. The inquisitors were convinced that many conversos were secretly practicing Judaism, making them heretics rather than infidels. Unlike Jews, who were merely non-Christians, heretics deserved death. For 14 years, the Inquisition had terrorized the converso community. Suspected Judaizers were tortured, their property confiscated, their families shamed. Thousands were burned alive in public ceremonies called auto de fe. The spectacle was both punishment and entertainment, demonstrating the power of the church and the consequences of religious deviation. But the presence of unconverted Jews complicated the Inquisition's work. How could conversos be expected to abandon Jewish practices if they were constantly exposed to Jewish neighbors, Jewish traditions, and Jewish learning? The solution was radical: eliminate the Jewish community entirely. The Alhambra Decree gave Spain's Jews until July 31, 1492, to convert or leave. Those who chose exile were forbidden to take gold, silver, or other precious metals with them. They could sell their possessions, but only to Christians and only at prices far below market value. They were to be stripped of their wealth and cast out of the only homeland many had ever known. Some Jews did convert. Families that had lived as Jews for centuries became Christians overnight, often keeping their Jewish practices in secret. But an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 Jews chose exile over conversion. They sold their houses for donkeys, their vineyards for cloth, their ancestral possessions for passage on overcrowded ships. Abraham Senner, the chief rabbi of Castile and Isabella's treasurer, chose conversion. At age 80, he was baptized along with his entire family, taking the name Fernando Pérez Coronel. But Isaac Abravanel, one of Spain's most prominent Jewish scholars and courtiers, chose exile despite his close relationship with the royal family. The exodus was chaos. Ships were overcrowded and unseaworthy. Captains cheated passengers, sometimes abandoning them on remote shores. Disease spread quickly in the cramped conditions. Pirates attacked refugee vessels, stealing what little wealth the exiles had managed to salvage. Some refugees attempted to reach North Africa, but many Muslim rulers were reluctant to accept large numbers of Jewish immigrants. Others tried to enter Portugal, but King João II allowed only temporary refuge and demanded payment of 8 cruzados per person. When the time limit expired, those who could not pay were enslaved. The largest number of Spanish Jewish refugees found sanctuary in the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bayezid II welcomed them, reportedly saying, "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine." The Ottomans recognized that the Spanish exiles brought valuable skills. They were merchants, artisans, physicians, and scholars who could contribute to the empire's prosperity. Sephardic Jewish communities were established in Istanbul, Thessalonica, Sarajevo, and dozens of other Ottoman cities. They maintained their Spanish language and customs, creating a diaspora within the diaspora. Even today, some elderly Sephardic Jews can still speak Ladino, preserving the Spanish their ancestors carried into exile 5 centuries ago. But the Spanish expulsion was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern of Jewish expulsion that swept through Europe in the late medieval period. England had expelled its Jews in 1290. France had done so in 1306 and again in 1394. Various German states, Italian cities, and Central European kingdoms had all expelled Jewish communities at different times. Portugal followed Spain's example in 1497, giving Jews the choice of conversion or exile. Unlike Spain, however, Portugal actually prevented most Jews from leaving, forcibly converting them at the ports of departure. This created a large population of new Christians whose Jewish identity was even more hidden and suspect than their Spanish counterparts. The pattern was always similar. Jews were invited to settle in a region because of their economic skills. They prospered and became integrated into local society. Anti-Jewish sentiment would build due to religious, economic, or political factors, and eventually they would be expelled or forced to convert. The cycle of acceptance and rejection, integration and expulsion, had become a defining feature of Jewish life in Christian Europe. Those Jews who remained in Western Europe after the Great Expulsions were largely conversos, Christians of Jewish descent who lived under constant suspicion. The Inquisition continued to hunt for crypto-Jews well into the 18th century, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and fear that affected even genuine converts. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe was becoming the new center of Jewish life. Poland-Lithuania, in particular, offered Jews opportunities that had disappeared in the West. Polish kings, seeking to develop their territory's commercial potential, invited Jewish merchants and craftsmen to settle in their lands. Jews were granted royal charters that protected their rights and allowed them to practice their religion freely. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became home to the largest Jewish population in the world. By 1650, an estimated 500,000 Jews lived in Poland-Lithuania, comprising about 5% of the total population. They spoke Yiddish, a language that combined Hebrew with medieval German and Slavic elements. They developed a rich culture of Talmudic scholarship, mystical spirituality, and folk tradition. Eastern European Jewish communities were more autonomous than their Western counterparts. They governed themselves through Kehillat, Jewish councils, that collected taxes, maintained religious institutions, and administered Jewish law. They created their own educational systems, centered on the Cheder, elementary school, and the Yeshiva, Talmudic academy. This was the world of the shtetl, the small Jewish towns that dotted the landscape of Eastern Europe. Life in the shtetl was poor but spiritually rich. Jews were peddlers and tailors, innkeepers and teachers, always at the margins of the broader economy but deeply embedded in their own communities. The great rabbis of Eastern Europe, figures like the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, and the Vilna Gaon, champion of traditional Talmudic scholarship, created new forms of Jewish spirituality and learning. Hasidism, in particular, offered a mystical and emotional approach to Judaism that appealed to ordinary Jews who felt excluded from elite Talmudic culture. But even in Eastern Europe, Jewish life was precarious. Cossack uprisings, particularly those led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky in 1648 to 1649, devastated Jewish communities in Ukraine and Poland. Tens of thousands of Jews were massacred, and entire regions were left without Jewish inhabitants. The massacres, known in Jewish memory as the Zirz Tachvitat, the decrees of 1648 to 1649, were comparable to the Crusade massacres of the 11th and 12th centuries. They reinforced the lesson that Jewish security was always temporary, always dependent on the tolerance of non-Jewish authorities. By 1700, the Jewish world had been fundamentally transformed. The great Sephardic communities of Spain and Portugal were gone, replaced by scattered refugee populations in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Americas. The Ashkenazi communities of Germany and France were greatly reduced. The new center of Jewish life was in Eastern Europe, where the majority of the world's Jews now lived. But this was still diaspora life, minority existence in someone else's land, subject to someone else's laws, dependent on someone else's tolerance. Jews had learned to be portable, to create communities that could be quickly abandoned, to invest in education and skills rather than land and fixed assets. The expulsions had not destroyed Jewish life, but they had confirmed its essential character. Jews were eternal wanderers, always temporary residents, always ready to move when conditions changed. The diaspora had become not just a political reality but a psychological condition, a permanent state of exile that shaped Jewish identity and Jewish consciousness. Part 5: Modern Antisemitism and the Return. The year 1894 should have been a time of celebration for French Jews. A century after the revolution had granted them citizenship, they were fully integrated into French society. They served in the army, practiced law, worked as journalists, and participated in politics. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French General Staff, seemed to embody this success. A patriotic Frenchman whose religion was incidental to his identity. Then came the accusation. Secret military documents had been passed to the German embassy. Dreyfus was arrested, court-martialed, and convicted of treason based on flimsy evidence and forged documents. On January 5, 1895, he was publicly stripped of his rank in a ceremony at the École Militaire while crowds shouted, "Death to the Jews!" Among the journalists covering the degradation was Theodor Herzl, a secular Viennese writer who had believed in the promise of Jewish assimilation. But as he listened to the Parisian mob's anti-Semitic chants, he realized that emancipation had failed. The Dreyfus case, he later wrote, embodies the desire of the vast majority of the French to condemn a Jew and to condemn all Jews in this one Jew. If this could happen in France, the country of liberté, égalité, fraternité, it could happen anywhere. Legal equality had not brought genuine acceptance. Education had not eliminated prejudice. Patriotism had not guaranteed security. The Jewish problem required a Jewish solution, a state of their own. Herzl's pamphlet Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, published in 1896, transformed Jewish politics. For centuries, Jews had responded to persecution with accommodation, conversion, or resignation. Herzl proposed something radical: political independence. The Jews who wish it will have their state, he declared. But Herzl was not alone in recognizing that modern antisemitism was different from its medieval predecessor. The 19th century had seen the emergence of racial theories that classified Jews not as adherents of a particular religion, but as members of a distinct and inferior race. This new scientific antisemitism was more dangerous than religious hatred because it offered no escape through conversion. A Jew could abandon Judaism, embrace Christianity, and serve his country with perfect loyalty, but he would still be considered racially Jewish, forever suspect, forever foreign. The racial theorists drew upon the language of modern science to legitimize ancient prejudices. Count Arthur de Gobineau's essay on the inequality of the human races and Houston Stewart Chamberlain's The Foundations of the 19th Century provided intellectual frameworks for viewing Jews as a corrupting influence on European civilization. These weren't the passionate sermons of medieval monks, but the measured prose of university professors and respected intellectuals. In Germany, the historian Heinrich von Treitschke popularized the phrase Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune, which would later become a Nazi slogan. Political parties organized around anti-Semitic platforms. In Austria, Karl Lueger built his career on anti-Jewish rhetoric and became mayor of Vienna. In Russia, the government sponsored pogroms while distributing the fabricated Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a document that would spread globally and fuel conspiracy theories for generations. This new antisemitism emerged paradoxically at the moment of greatest Jewish integration into European society. As legal barriers fell and Jews entered universities, professions, and cultural life, resentment grew among those who saw them as unwelcome competitors. The success of Jewish bankers like the Rothschilds, intellectuals like Karl Marx, and composers like Felix Mendelssohn was cited as evidence of Jewish power and influence rather than individual achievement. The pogrom in Kishinev in 1903 crystallized the crisis. Over Easter weekend, mobs rampaged through the Jewish quarter of this Moldovan city, killing 47 people and destroying hundreds of homes and businesses. The Russian authorities had done nothing to prevent the violence and little to stop it. For many Jews, Kishinev proved that even in the modern world, they remained vulnerable to medieval-style massacres. Young Jews began to question the strategies their parents had pursued. Assimilation had failed. The more successfully Jews integrated, the more they were resented. Religious orthodoxy offered spiritual comfort but no political protection. Revolutionary socialism promised to eliminate all forms of oppression, but Jewish radicals often found themselves unwelcome in movements that viewed Jewish identity as a relic of the feudal past. Into this intellectual ferment came competing visions of Jewish survival. The Bundists argued for Jewish cultural autonomy within a socialist framework, preserving Yiddish language and secular Jewish culture while fighting for workers' rights. The territorialists, led by Israel Zangwill, sought to establish a Jewish homeland anywhere that would accept them, Uganda, Argentina, anywhere but the dangerous cauldron of Europe. But it was Herzl's political Zionism that captured the imagination of growing numbers of Jews. The first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897 brought together delegates from across Europe and beyond to plan for Jewish statehood. They designed a flag, composed an anthem, and established the institutions that would, they hoped, govern a future Jewish state. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state, Herzl wrote in his diary. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it. The early Zionists faced enormous obstacles. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, inhabited primarily by Arabs who had lived there for centuries. The Jewish population was small and largely Orthodox, often opposed to the secular nationalism of the Zionist pioneers. European Jews had established comfortable lives and were reluctant to abandon them for an uncertain future in a distant land. Many rabbis condemned Zionism as an attempt to force God's hand, arguing that the return to Zion must await the Messiah. Yet the movement grew. Young Jews from Russia and Poland began arriving in Palestine in waves of immigration called Aliyah. They drained swamps, planted forests, and established agricultural settlements. They revived Hebrew as a spoken language after nearly 2 millennia as a liturgical tongue. They created a new Jewish culture that was neither the religious traditionalism of the shtetl nor the assimilated cosmopolitanism of Western Europe. The second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, brought 40,000 immigrants, including many who would later become leaders of the Jewish state. Among them was David Gruin, who would change his name to David Ben-Gurion and become Israel's first prime minister. These pioneers faced enormous hardships, malaria, poverty, Arab hostility, and Ottoman bureaucracy, but they persevered with the conviction that they were rebuilding an ancient homeland. Their experiment might have remained a minor footnote in history, but World War was approaching. The Ottoman Empire would soon choose the wrong side in a global conflict, creating opportunities for those who dreamed of reshaping the Middle East. And in the corridors of power in London, a British politician named Arthur Balfour was beginning to see how Jewish national aspirations might serve British imperial interests. The stage was set for the most dramatic chapter in the long history of Jewish exile and return. After nearly 2,000 years, the wandering might finally end. But first would come the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history, a systematic attempt to eliminate the Jewish people entirely from the face of the earth. Part 6. The Catastrophe and the State. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild that would reshape the Middle East. The Balfour Declaration committed Britain to supporting the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was fewer than 70 words long, but it represented the first major power endorsement of Jewish national aspirations in nearly 2 millennia. The declaration emerged from the intersection of wartime strategy and genuine sympathy. Britain needed allies as the Great War dragged on, and Jewish influence in America and Russia seemed valuable. But Balfour and Prime Minister Lloyd George were also influenced by their Protestant upbringing, which had taught them to revere the biblical connection between Jews and the Holy Land. The treatment of the race had been a disgrace to Christendom, Balfour later explained. The Palestinian Arabs, who comprised over 90% of the population, were not consulted. The declaration promised to protect their civil and religious rights, but said nothing about their political aspirations. This fundamental contradiction, two peoples claiming the same land, would define the next century of Middle Eastern conflict. Jewish immigration to Palestine accelerated after the war. The Third Aliyah brought 35,000 immigrants between 1919 and 1923, many of them refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe. They found a land where Jewish and Arab communities lived in an uneasy coexistence that periodically erupted into violence. The 1929 riots in Jerusalem and Hebron killed 133 Jews and 110 Arabs, foreshadowing decades of bloodshed. But Palestine was not the only refuge Jews sought as conditions in Europe deteriorated. The United States had absorbed 2 million Jewish immigrants between 1880 and 1920, creating vibrant communities in New York, Chicago, and other cities. Then, in 1924, America closed its doors. The National Origins Act established quotas that severely restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, a thinly veiled attempt to keep out Jews and other undesirable groups. The timing could not have been worse. In Germany, economic crisis and political instability were creating conditions for extremism. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party remained a marginal force in the 1920s, but its anti-Semitic ideology was gaining ground. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, they moved quickly to isolate and persecute Germany's 500,000 Jews. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jewish businesses were boycotted and eventually confiscated. Jewish lawyers, doctors, and professors lost their licenses. The message was clear: Jews had no future in Nazi Germany. Yet the international community's response was shamefully inadequate. At the Avion Conference of 1938, 32 nations met to discuss the refugee crisis. Delegate after delegate expressed sympathy for Jewish suffering while explaining why their country could not accept more immigrants. Australia's representative summed up the prevailing attitude: as we have no real racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one. The few countries that did open their doors, China, which created a refuge in Shanghai, or the Dominican Republic, which accepted Jewish farmers, could absorb only a fraction of those seeking escape. Palestine remained the most viable option, but British authorities, seeking to appease Arab opposition, severely restricted Jewish immigration just when it was most desperately needed. On November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, shattered any remaining illusions about Jewish safety in Nazi Germany. Synagogues burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The world watched, expressed regret, and did nothing. When war came in September 1939, Hitler's armies swept across Europe, bringing Nazi racial ideology to Poland, France, the Netherlands, and beyond. In Poland alone, 3 million Jews found themselves trapped under Nazi occupation. The ghettos of Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow became overcrowded prisons where Jews were systematically starved and brutalized. But ghettoization was only the beginning. On January 20th, 1942, Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin to coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic murder of European Jewry. The Holocaust had begun. The scale of the killing was unprecedented. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other death camps, Nazi Germany constructed an industrial apparatus of murder. Jews from across occupied Europe were transported in cattle cars to these facilities, where most were killed within hours of arrival. By war's end, 6 million Jews, one-third of the world's Jewish population, had been murdered. The Holocaust was not just mass murder. It was an attempt at cultural annihilation. The Nazis destroyed synagogues, burned Jewish books, and murdered rabbis and scholars. Entire communities that had existed for centuries, the Jews of Salonika, the scholars of Vilna, the Hasidic courts of Poland, were obliterated. The rich Yiddish culture of Eastern Europe, which had produced writers like Sholem Aleichem and I.L. Peretz, musicians like the klezmers, and countless everyday voices, was silenced forever. Yet even in the darkest moments, resistance flickered. In the Warsaw Ghetto, young Jews led by Mordecai Anielewicz fought the German army for nearly a month in 1943. Partisans operated in the forests of Eastern Europe. Jewish prisoners revolted at Treblinka and Sobibor. These acts of defiance could not prevent the Holocaust, but they affirmed that Jewish dignity survived even in the face of systematic dehumanization. As Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in 1945, the world finally saw the full extent of Nazi crimes. The skeletal survivors, the mountains of corpses, the industrial machinery of death, all testified to what could happen when antisemitism was allowed to reach its logical conclusion. "We knew something terrible was happening," recalled one American soldier who liberated Dachau, "but we never imagined anything like this." The Holocaust transformed the Jewish condition fundamentally. For centuries, Jews had debated whether they needed their own state. After 1945, the question was whether they could survive without one. The survivors who emerged from the camps, the displaced persons languishing in refugee centers, the Jewish communities worldwide grappling with the magnitude of the loss, all looked to Palestine as the only guarantee against future catastrophe. But Palestine was in chaos. Jewish and Arab communities, already in conflict, were now joined by Holocaust survivors desperate for refuge. The British, exhausted by war and unable to reconcile their conflicting promises to Jews and Arabs, announced their intention to withdraw. The United Nations proposed partition, separate Jewish and Arab states, but the Arab world rejected the plan. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate ended, David Ben-Gurion stood in the Tel Aviv Museum and read Israel's Declaration of Independence. "The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people," he proclaimed. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. After nearly 2,000 years, Jewish political sovereignty had been restored. The surrounding Arab states immediately attacked, determined to strangle the Jewish state at birth. Against overwhelming odds, Israel survived. The War of Independence created two refugee populations: Palestinian Arabs who fled or were expelled from their homes, and Mizrahi Jews who were forced to leave Arab countries where their families had lived for centuries. Israel and Iran, the modern shadow of ancient rivalries. In the decades following Israel's founding, a new adversary emerged: Iran. Once allies during the early years of Israeli statehood, relations soured after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when the Islamic Republic replaced the Shah's pro-Western regime. The new leadership, guided by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, saw Israel not only as a Western outpost in the Muslim world, but as an illegitimate occupier of Muslim lands. This ideological stance, grounded in a revolutionary form of Sharia Islam, positioned Iran as a regional power opposing Zionism and Western influence. Over time, Iran began funding and arming militant groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, both of which reject Israel's right to exist. Israel, in turn, viewed Iran's growing regional influence and its advancing nuclear program as existential threats. Covert cyber attacks, proxy wars, airstrikes on Iranian assets in Syria, and mutual accusations have defined a conflict that is less about direct war and more about strategic dominance and survival. The Israel-Iran rivalry thus reflects a dangerous fusion of theology, geopolitics, and security anxiety in a region already shaped by overlapping historical traumas. Epilogue: the eternal question. Today, more than 75 years after Israel's establishment, the Jewish experience remains defined by the tension between integration and independence, between belonging and otherness. Israel has become a regional power, a technological innovator, and a haven for Jews from around the world. The United States hosts the largest Jewish community in history, one that has achieved unprecedented success and acceptance. Yet antisemitism persists. It adapts to each generation, taking new forms while maintaining ancient hatreds. In the 21st century, it appears as neo-Nazi violence, Islamist extremism, and anti-Zionist rhetoric that sometimes masks traditional anti-Semitic tropes. Social media amplifies conspiracy theories that echo medieval blood libels. University campuses witness debates about Jewish identity and Israeli policy that sometimes cross the line into antisemitism. The questions that have haunted Jewish existence for millennia remain unresolved. Can Jews be fully accepted as equal citizens in Gentile societies, or will they always be regarded as outsiders? Does Jewish survival require political sovereignty, or can it be maintained through cultural and religious continuity? How can Jews balance particular identity with universal values, tribal loyalty with cosmopolitan ideals? Perhaps these questions have no final answers because they reflect the fundamental human tension between the desire to belong and the need to remain distinct. The Jewish experience, shaped by exile and return, persecution and triumph, assimilation and resistance, illuminates both the possibilities and the limits of human community. The story of the Jews is not yet finished. In Israel and the diaspora, in universities and laboratories, in synagogues and secular institutions, Jews continue to wrestle with the eternal questions of identity and belonging. They remain, as they have always been, a people between worlds, citizens of the countries where they live, members of an ancient covenant, bearers of a memory that spans millennia. The wandering may have ended with the establishment of Israel, but the questioning continues. It is perhaps this perpetual questioning, this refusal to accept easy answers about identity, justice, and meaning, that remains the most distinctive aspect of Jewish civilization. In a world of certainties, Jews remain eternal questioners, forever wrestling with angels, forever seeking answers that may not exist. The exile is over, but the journey continues. And in that continuation lies both the burden and the promise of Jewish existence in the modern world. This is Hugh from World History Marathon. Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe for more great stories.